June Bellamy didn't expect the most dangerous man in Chicago to hold her hand and not let go. She was just working her night shift. 3 hours and 7 minutes in the morning, second floor of the alcove, the VIP room that should have been empty since midnight. She pushed through the door with her cleaning cart, eyes still adjusting to the dark, and she didn't see him sitting in the corner. Preston Shaw, 33, owner of a high-end restaurant chain on paper, head of the Shaw organization in reality, the man the entire Great Lakes underworld called the Quiet, because he'd never once needed to raise his voice to make someone disappear. He was sitting there in the dark, alone, in front of a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking because he couldn't taste it. Hadn't been able to taste anything in 14 months. June pulled a chair to wipe the floor underneath. The chair leg rolled over his ankle. She panicked, bent down on instinct. Her hand touched his ankle through the fabric of his trousers, and Preston Shaw, the man who hadn't felt pain, warmth, cold, or anything on his skin for over 14 months, went still. Not because it hurt, because for the first time in over a year, he felt the warmth of another person's hand. He reached down, placed his hand over hers where it touched his ankle, and held it there, said nothing. June looked up in the dark, saw a pair of gray-blue eyes staring down at her hand with an expression she couldn't name. Not anger, not threat, but the face of someone who'd just taken their first sip of water after crossing a desert. She said, voice shaking, "I'm sorry, I didn't know anyone was in here." He said 2 words, voice rough, not a command, more like a plea from a man who'd never begged anyone for anything in his life. "Don't pull away. If you want to know why the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago begged a cleaning girl not to pull her hand away, this story's for you. Hit like if you're ready, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next." He held her hand for exactly 1 minute. June knew because she counted. She counted every second in her head the way she used to count when she was little, every time she sat in the waiting room of the social services office, waiting for an adult she had never met before to walk in and say, "Come on, sweetheart." 60 seconds. No one said anything. He didn't move. Neither did she. She only knelt there, her hand still resting on his ankle, and he sat in the dark with his hand laid over hers as if he were holding something he feared would dissolve if he gripped it any tighter. Then he let go. Not slowly, not quickly, with no expression on his face at all. He released her hand the way a person sets a glass of water down on a table, calmly, as though those 60 seconds had never happened. "You can go," he said. His voice had returned to normal, flat, cold, the voice the entire Great Lakes underworld was used to hearing. June stood up. Her knees were stiff from kneeling too long on the wooden floor, and she nearly lost her balance. But she didn't reach out to hold on to anything. Instinct told her not to touch him one more time. She stepped back twice, bowed her head, turned around, and pushed the cleaning cart out of the room. She didn't look back. She didn't run. She walked with the steady rhythm she had practiced for 3 years inside the alcove. The rhythm of someone who knew how to turn herself into air. The rhythm that said, "I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything. I don't know anything." She finished the night shift. She cleaned the 3 remaining rooms on the first floor, changed the trash bag at the bar, sprayed the mirrors in the men's restroom, and folded the white towels again in the employee break room. Her hands followed the right sequence. Her mind was somewhere else. Her mind was still on the second floor, inside that dark room, with those blue-gray eyes looking down at her hand with the gaze of a man who had just seen light after a year inside a sealed room. She left the alcove at 6:15 in the morning. Chicago in early November was gray and cold, the kind of damp cold that clung to the bones without needing wind. She walked 7 blocks to the bus stop, waited 14 minutes, then rode the bus 40 minutes back to the south side. Her studio apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old brick building where the elevator had died last summer and no one had fixed it. She opened the door. Bread was curled up on the dryer in the corner of the room, exactly where the cat lay every night, exactly where it lay every morning when she came home. The cat opened one eye to look at her, then closed it again. June sat down on the edge of the bed. She didn't take off her shoes. She didn't turn on the light. She sat there in the darkness of her own room and looked at her right hand, the place where he had laid his hand over hers. It wasn't warm anymore. She knew it wasn't warm anymore because more than an hour had passed, because she had mopped floors and sprayed glass and stood outside in the cold for 14 minutes. But something in the patch of skin where she had touched his skin still felt different, as though the cells there had remembered something her mind hadn't yet had time to process. She closed her hand, opened it, Closed it again. Forget it, she told herself. This has nothing to do with you. You pulled a chair, and it rolled over his foot. He didn't cry out in pain. He held your hand. He told you to go. That's all. There's nothing here. Nothing worth remembering. She had survived 3 years inside the alcove by following one rule exactly. Don't look at what you're not supposed to see. Don't listen to what you're not supposed to hear. Don't know what you're not supposed to know. That rule had kept her alive, kept her employed, kept a roof over her head. The 2 times she saw stains on the floor of a VIP room that weren't spilled liquor, she cleaned them up, didn't ask, didn't tell. That was why she had lasted 3 years in a place where the average employee lasted 6 months. Forget it. She pulled the blanket up, lay down, and closed her eyes. Bread jumped from the dryer onto the bed, settled beside her knee, and began to purr in a steady rhythm. A familiar sound, a familiar room, everything in its proper place. But she couldn't sleep. She lay there until sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, and she still saw those blue-gray eyes, and she still heard that rough voice saying 2 words she didn't know how to forget, even though she had tried, even though she knew forgetting was the safest thing she could do. The next night, June arrived at the alcove at 2 o'clock in the morning, just like always. She had spent the whole day telling herself that nothing had happened. She had managed to sleep for 4 hours, showered, fed bread, walked to Helen's laundromat to pick up her clothes, and on the way home she had stopped to buy a box of instant noodles. Everything was normal. Everything was in its proper place. She walked in through the rear employee entrance, swiped her card, pushed the door open, and there was a man standing just inside, Garrett Yates. She knew him. Every employee at the alcove knew him. He was Preston Shaw's right hand, the man who stood second in every room Preston entered, the man the head chef had once told her. If Shaw is the knife, Yates is the hand holding the knife, and you don't want to touch either end. He was leaning against the wall beside the door, one hand holding a cup of black coffee, the kind of paper cup from the automatic coffee machine in the kitchen. His fingers trembled faintly against the rim of the cup, not from the cold, because inside the alcove, it was never cold. It was the kind of trembling that lived in the fingers of someone who had drunk too much coffee and slept too little for too many months. His eyes fixed on her, and they were eyes with shadows so deep beneath them they looked bruised, the eyes of a man carrying something heavier than his own strength, but not allowed to set it down. "Miss Bellamy," he said. It wasn't a question. June stopped. Her hand was still on the door. Garrett drew a thick white envelope from the pocket of his suit jacket, unmarked, no name written on it, and held it out to her. 5,000, he said. Cash. You take it. Forget last night, and don't go up to the 2nd floor anymore. The cleaning shift for the 2nd floor will be given to someone else. You'll keep working the 1st floor like before. No one will ask you anything else. His voice was flat, not threatening, not intimidating. He spoke like a man reading the terms of a contract. Cold, professional, with no room for feeling. But June had lived long enough around dangerous people to know that kind of cold was 10 times more dangerous than shouting. She looked at the envelope. She looked at Garrett. $5,000. She calculated quickly in her head. 4 months of rent, 3 months of food, half a year of bus fare. $5,000 was a lot of money for someone whose bank account usually shifted between $300 and $600. But she calculated something else, too. If she took that envelope, she was admitting she had seen something. And people didn't pay for silence from someone they planned to keep around. People paid for silence from someone they planned to remove. I need this job more than $5,000, June said. Garrett didn't blink. If I take the money, she continued, and her voice didn't shake, not because she was brave, but because she had already finished the math. I lose my job. If I lose my job, I lose my home in 6 weeks. I don't have family. I don't have anywhere else to go. This job is the only thing keeping a roof over my head, and I'm not trading that roof for an envelope. Garrett looked at her. He looked at her longer than she thought he would. And she saw something very small change in his eyes. Not pity, not respect, but recognition. He recognized that she wasn't a threat, not because she was loyal, not because she was afraid, but because she was someone who had nothing but this job. She had no one to tell. No one important enough for her to risk her roof over a story. She was safe, not because she was trustworthy, but because she had nothing to lose, and a person with nothing to lose had no reason to betray anyone. He tucked the envelope back into his jacket pocket. He didn't say another word. He took a sip of coffee, pushed himself away from the wall, and walked down the corridor toward the stairs leading to the second floor. June stood alone by the employee entrance, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. Then she pushed out the cleaning cart and began her shift. She cleaned the first floor. She didn't go up to the second floor. She didn't ask anyone anything. The next night, she did exactly the same thing. The night after that, too. 3 nights passed, and no one mentioned her. No one looked at her differently. No one brought her another envelope. 3 nights of complete silence. And June told herself that was it, that the story ended here, that she would keep mopping the first floor until she grew old, or until the alcove closed, or until she found another job, whichever came first. Then, on the 4th night, while she was wiping down the bar on the first floor, the intercom speaker in the kitchen clicked on, and that voice came through, the voice she had spent 4 days trying to forget, flat, low, with no room for refusal. "Miss Bellamy, come up to the second floor." June set the mop down, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked toward the stairs. Her heart was beating fast, but her feet moved evenly. She had learned a very long time ago that fear was a luxury. She could be afraid later, when she got home, when she locked the door, when bread lay in her lap, and the dryer hummed steadily in the corner of the room. But right now, she walked. The stairs leading up to the second floor of the alcove were narrow, covered in dark red carpet worn thin down the middle, with pale yellow lights along the wall. She had cleaned these stairs hundreds of times, but she had never climbed them by invitation. She always went up because of her shift. Up and down, clean and leave. She pushed open the VIP room door. The room was brighter than it had been that night, but only just enough. A desk lamp sat at the head of the long table, casting warm yellow light over half of Preston Shaw's face, while the other half sank into shadow. He was sitting in the same place as before, at the head of the table, in the high-backed chair, like a man who had never left that spot. The glass of whiskey was no longer on the table. There were no papers, no phone, nothing but the lamp and him. June stood at the door. She didn't take another step. She waited. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. "Sit down." She looked around the room. There was a lower chair on the left side of the table, about 2 meters away from him. She pulled it out and sat down. She sat with her back straight, both hands resting on her thighs, eyes facing forward, in the exact posture she had learned a very long time ago, the posture of someone saying, "I'm here, but I'm not taking up space." Preston said nothing for about 10 seconds. He looked at her, and she felt that gaze on her face the way a person feels the temperature shift when someone opens a window. Then he spoke, and his voice wasn't the voice of a mafia boss giving an order, but the voice of a person reading his own medical results aloud to a stranger. Flat, precise, without emotion. "I have a medical condition. My body can't feel anything. No pain, no heat, no cold, nothing at all. I've seen doctors. It hasn't worked." He paused. His finger tapped once against the tabletop. Just once, then stopped. "That night, when you touched me, that was the first exception. The first time I'd felt anything since this condition began. I don't know why. I can't explain it, but I want to try again." June said nothing. She listened. She let each sentence fall into her mind and arranged them slowly, like fitting together pieces of a puzzle when she still hadn't seen the whole picture. He couldn't feel anything. She remembered that night. The chair leg had rolled over his ankle, and he hadn't even winced. He didn't react to pain. He reacted to her hand. Only her hand. "You have the right to refuse," he said. "If you refuse, you'll keep your job. No one will touch you. Garrett won't look for you again. You'll work the first floor shift like before. I won't call you up here ever again." He said that, and she believed him. She didn't know why she believed him, because he was the kind of man she shouldn't believe, because everything about him was the kind of thing she had spent her whole life learning to avoid. But the way he said, "You have the right to refuse," didn't sound like the way a person spoke when offering her a fake choice. It sounded like the way a person spoke when he was truly afraid she would say no. "What does trying again mean?" she asked. It was the first thing she had said since entering the room. Preston looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something on the half of his face lit by the lamp that wasn't emptiness. It was in his eyes, very quick, very small, like a match flame just struck in the wind, not yet knowing whether it would keep burning. "I don't know yet," he said. 3 words. And they were the most honest 3 words June had ever heard a powerful man say. Not, "I'll take care of you." Not, "Trust me." Not a beautiful promise she had heard too many times from too many adults in her life to believe anymore. Just, "I don't know yet." He didn't know what he needed. He only knew that for hundreds of days, he hadn't felt anything. And then her hand had touched him, and he had felt. And now he was sitting here, alone, in this dark room, asking whether she would allow him to try one more time. June looked at him. She looked at the half of his face in the light, and the half of his face in the dark, and she recognized the expression on his face. She knew that face, not because she had seen it on him, but because she had seen it on herself. In the bathroom mirror, every time a new foster family opened the door and said, "Welcome home." The face of someone trying to believe that this time, the good thing would stay, even though every time before, it hadn't stayed. Even though the body had learned not to hope, but something deeper than the body still refused to stop. "All right," she said. "I agree." Garrett arranged everything within 24 hours. June's second-floor cleaning shift was given to someone else, and she was assigned a new task, making nighttime drinks for the VIP room. The reason written on the duty roster was staff reassignment according to operational needs, the kind of reason no one read closely and no one asked about. The small drink station sat at the end of the second-floor hallway, with a semi-professional coffee machine, a mini fridge, and a set of white porcelain cups that June had to wash by hand one by one because they weren't allowed in the dishwasher. On the first night, she made a cup of black coffee, no sugar, no milk, set it on a silver tray, and walked into the VIP room. There were 4 people in the room. Preston sat at the head of the table. Garrett stood behind his shoulder. 2 other men whose names June didn't know sat in the middle, papers spread out in front of them, their faces tense, the kind of faces worn by people trying to present something they knew the man at the head of the table didn't want to hear. June placed the cup of coffee on Preston's right side. He didn't look at her. He was looking at the 2 men, and that gaze was like a frozen lake, flat and still, with nothing alive beneath it. But when her fingers left the handle and his fingers touched the handle at the same time, there were 2 seconds when her skin touched his. 2 seconds. He didn't look down. He didn't change expression, but his fingers stayed on the cup handle longer than necessary, and June felt, very faintly, very briefly, the pressure of his fingers increase over hers, as if he were confirming that she was here, that she was real, that these 2 seconds were real. Then she withdrew her hand. She stepped back. She left the room. He lifted the cup of coffee and drank. The coffee had just been brewed, hot enough to send up steam, and he took a long sip without wincing, without blowing on it, without reacting to the temperature at all, as if he were drinking plain water at room temperature. The second night was the same. The third night was the same. June brought in the coffee, set the cup down, their fingers touching in the moment of transfer, and then she left. But by the 5th night, that moment lasted longer. When she set the cup down and began to pull her hand away, his fingers kept it there, not gripping, not pulling, just his fingers there, resting over hers, and he didn't withdraw. 3 seconds, maybe 4. June stood beside the table, slightly bent forward, her hand still on the cup handle, and she felt the pulse at the tips of her fingers, or maybe it was the pulse at the tips of his fingers. She couldn't tell the difference. Then he let go. She left the room. No one in the room looked at her. Garrett looked, but Garrett always looked. That was his job. On the 7th night, 4 seconds. On the 9th night, 5 seconds. And this time it wasn't only the fingertips. His index finger lay along her index finger, from the first joint to the third, resting lightly, not pressing, the way someone places a finger on a page to hold the place they are reading. On the 12th night, his whole hand closed around hers on the body of the cup, not gripping. He only laid his palm over the back of her hand, his fingers closing around her fingers, and they both held the cup of coffee between their hands. No one drinking, no one letting go, no one looking at each other. 7 seconds, maybe 8. She didn't count anymore because she had begun to forget how to count whenever he touched her. He never looked at her when other people were in the room, not once. He looked at the papers, at Garrett, at the person across from him, at anything except her. She was air. She was the girl who made coffee. She didn't exist. But beneath the table, in the moment when the cup changed hands, his fingers found hers with the precision of a man who had counted every night until he could touch her again. Then everyone left. The men under him stood up, bowed their heads, and went to the door. Garrett was the last one, and before stepping out, he looked at June once, a look with no expression, but she understood it as, "I'm watching." The door closed. The room was empty. Only he and she remained, and the desk lamp. Preston set the cooled cup of coffee on the table, pushed it gently toward her, and said, in a voice lower than the one he had used throughout the meeting, lower than the one he used with Garrett, so low it was almost breath-given shape, "This cup has gone cold, Miss Bellamy." It wasn't a comment about the coffee. She knew. He knew she knew. She picked up the cup, stood, and said, "I'll make a fresh one." She went out to the drink station, poured coffee into a clean porcelain cup, and returned to the room. He was still sitting there, in the empty room, the desk lamp lighting half his face, and when she set the new cup down, he didn't take the handle. He placed both hands over hers on the body of the cup, and he held on. He didn't drink. He didn't speak. He only held the warmth of the coffee cup and the warmth of her hand underneath it, and June stood there, in the quietest room in Chicago, beside the most dangerous man in Chicago, and she felt something she had no word for, a strange kind of peace, a peace she hadn't known existed, the peace of being needed by someone without being taken away by someone. On the 18th night, after everyone had left and the door had closed, June set the second cup of coffee on the table like always. But that evening, Preston didn't place his hand over hers right away. He looked down at the cloth bag she had set under the chair, the bag she carried with her on every shift, because inside it were her house keys, her wallet, and the book she always kept with her. One corner of the book was sticking out from the mouth of the bag, the cover old and frayed, the spine peeling. He bent down and pulled it out before she could react. The Oxford Dictionary, hardcover, printed in 1987, the kind with a dark blue cover that had yellowed along the edges. June had bought it for 50 cents at a garage sale 3 years earlier, and she had read it from A to P, one page each night, not in order, just opening it wherever it opened and reading from there. Preston flipped through the dictionary, stopped at a random page, and read aloud, "Sonder." June opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. "That word isn't in Oxford," she said. She heard her own voice, and she wanted to slap herself. She had just corrected Preston Shaw, in his private room, at 3 o'clock in the morning, about a dictionary. She waited for the consequence. She waited for the cold stare, or the heavy kind of silence, or for Garrett to somehow sense through the wall that she had just made a mistake and appear at the door. But Preston looked at her, and one corner of his mouth shifted upward, not a smile, only his facial muscles moving in a direction she had never seen them move before, and he said, "Then explain it to me." June looked at the dictionary in his hand, then at him, then back at the dictionary, and she said, "Sonder is a made-up word. It comes from the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. It means the moment when you realize that every stranger passing you on the street has a life as complex, vast, and complete as your own, that each of them is the main character in their own story, and you're only a nameless passerby in that story." Preston said nothing. He set the dictionary down on the table, face up, the page open. He stared into the space in front of him, and stayed silent for a very long time, so long that June began to think she should stand up and leave, that maybe she had said the wrong thing, that maybe a man who had lived inside his own head for hundreds of days didn't want to hear about how every stranger on the street mattered just as much as he did. Then he said softly, "I haven't thought about anyone but myself in a very long time. I don't know when I stopped, but I stopped." He looked at her. "Tell me about your life. Not tell me something. Not talk so I won't feel bored. But tell me about your life. Direct. Specific. As if her life were something worth hearing, and he wanted to hear it." June didn't know where to begin. She wasn't in the habit of talking about herself. She wasn't in the habit of being asked, but she looked at him sitting there, in that quiet room, his eyes open, waiting without rushing her, and she began to tell him about Mrs. Morrison. Mrs. Morrison was her 6th foster mother. June came to her house at 14, after she had already passed through 5 families before that, none of whom had kept her for more than a year. Mrs. Morrison lived in a small house outside Rockford, with a little kitchen, a backyard planted with tomatoes and basil. And she had one habit. Every Sunday evening, she cooked for the whole week, and she made June stand beside her in the kitchen and learn, not teaching like a teacher, but the way she would hand June a paring knife and say, "Peel the potatoes. Thinly now. Don't waste any." And June would peel, and Mrs. Morrison would peel beside her, and neither of them would say much. But the kitchen was warm, and the smell of fried onions filled the whole house. That was the first time in June's life she felt like she had a home. Not because the house was beautiful, not because Mrs. Morrison said, "You're my daughter," or anything grand like that, but because every Sunday evening, Mrs. Morrison was there, in the kitchen, with the potato peeler, waiting for her. That repetition, that consistency, that was something June had never had before. Then Mrs. Morrison got sick. Very sick. The kind of illness people didn't name in front of children. The system moved June away within 2 weeks. She didn't get to say goodbye. She didn't know whether Mrs. Morrison recovered. She never went back to Rockford to find out, because she had learned that going back only confirmed what she already knew, that every good thing was temporary, and her job was to keep moving, not to stand still and look. June stopped talking. She realized she had said more than she usually said in an entire month. She looked at Preston. His eyes were closed. She didn't know when he had closed them. He sat still, his head tilted back slightly, eyes shut, and she panicked for 1 second because she thought he had fallen asleep, that she had told a story so dull it had made a mafia boss doze off. But then he spoke without opening his eyes, his voice very soft, softer than any voice she had ever heard him use. "What did she teach you to cook?" June heard that question, and she understood he hadn't been sleeping. He had been listening. He closed his eyes because that was the only way he knew how to listen without hiding, the only way he didn't have to keep the flat, unreadable face he wore in front of everyone else. He closed his eyes because if he opened them, she would see something there that he wasn't ready for her to see. "Mashed potatoes," June said. She said the secret was that the butter had to be twice as much as you thought was enough. Preston didn't open his eyes, but the corner of his mouth lifted for the second time that night, and this time it stayed a little longer, only a few seconds, but long enough for June to see it, and long enough for her to understand that she had just given a man who couldn't feel anything in his own body, something the doctors couldn't give him, a reason to listen. It happened one morning at 5:10, when June pushed open the back door of the alcove and stepped into the narrow alley behind the restaurant. The sky wasn't fully light yet, only that murky gray glow of Chicago in early winter, when the streetlights were still yellow, but the eastern edge of the sky had already begun to pale. She zipped her coat up to her chin, shoved her hands into her pockets, and started walking toward the bus stop. She had taken 4 steps when she realized she wasn't walking alone. 2 men were standing at the end of the alley, leaning against the brick walls on both sides, their hands tucked into their coat pockets, standing in exactly the way people stood when they had been waiting there for a while and weren't in any hurry to leave. One was tall, with close-cropped hair and sun-browned skin, the kind of tan that belonged to someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. The other was shorter, broad-shouldered, wearing a thick black coat, and his right hand had come out of his pocket holding a phone. He raised the phone and took a picture. A small click, no flash, but June heard the sound. She stopped. Her instincts told her 2 things at once: run and stay still. She stayed still. Running in a narrow alley was a bad idea when 2 men were blocking the end of it. "June Bellamy?" the tall one asked. His voice was ordinary, not cold, not threatening, like he was confirming a name for a delivery. She didn't answer. "What are you doing in Shaw's Club every night?" the second man asked, still looking at his phone screen as if he were checking the photo he had just taken. She didn't answer. The tall man tilted his head and looked at her, an assessing kind of look, as though he were deciding whether she was worth another sentence. Then he slipped his hand back into his pocket, pushed his back off the wall, and the 2 of them walked past her, heading toward the other end of the alley, disappearing around the corner. They didn't touch her. They didn't say another word. They didn't need to. June stood in the alley for another 30 seconds before her legs started moving again. She walked to the bus stop, got on the bus, sat down by the window, and for the entire 40-minute ride back to the south side, she didn't think. She rested her head against the window glass as it trembled softly with the rhythm of the bus, and she didn't think at all, because if she started thinking, she would have to face the truth that someone knew her name, knew her work schedule, and had just taken her photograph at the back door of the alcove. She didn't tell Preston. She told Garrett. She called him on the phone number he had left her after the night with the envelope of money. The number he had said was, "Only for emergencies, and I'll decide what counts as an emergency. Not you, she called at 7 o'clock in the morning. Garrett picked up after the second ring. She told him briefly, adding nothing, leaving nothing out. Two men, the back alley. They knew her name, took a picture, asked what she was doing in the club. Garrett was silent for 3 seconds after she finished speaking. 3 seconds of Garrett was a very long time. She had been close enough to him long enough to know that he processed information faster than most people, and if he needed 3 seconds, then this information wasn't small. Go home, he said. Lock the door. Don't talk to anyone. I'll handle it. 24 hours later, Garrett called back. They've been reminded, he said. Don't ask anything else. June didn't ask anything else. She didn't ask what reminded meant. She didn't ask who those two men were, what organization they belonged to, or what they wanted. She didn't ask because she knew every question would pull her deeper into a world she had chosen to stand only at the edge of, and the edge was the safest place she could stand. But that night, lying in her studio apartment with bread curled on her chest, she didn't think about the two men in the alley. She didn't think about the sound of the picture being taken, or the question they had asked, or Garrett's 3 seconds of silence on the phone. She lay there with her eyes closed, and what appeared behind her eyelids was Preston's hand closing around hers on the body of the coffee cup, the warmth of the hot porcelain, the slight pressure of his fingers on the back of her hand, and the way he closed his eyes when he listened to her talk about Mrs. Morrison, as though her voice was the only thing he wanted to feel. She lay there and understood that she should have been more afraid than she was, and that, the fact that she wasn't afraid enough, was the very thing that kept her awake until morning. Helen Cross never asked June about work. In the 3 years, June had lived on the 3rd floor of the old brick building on the south side, while Helen lived on the 1st floor with her small laundromat opening onto the street. She hadn't asked once. She knew June worked the night shift. She knew because June brought her clothes down to wash at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and picked them up at 10 o'clock at night. The exact schedule of someone who slept during the day and stayed awake at night. She knew June lived alone. She knew because June only washed clothes for one person, and her laundry bag was so small that Helen sometimes washed it together with her own without charging extra. And when June objected, Helen would say, "There's still room in the machine. Wasting water is the real sin." She never asked June anything June didn't offer on her own. And June almost never offered anything, and the two of them had lived side by side that way for 3 years without either one crossing that boundary, until that morning. June stopped by the laundromat to pick up her clothes on her way to buy instant noodles, and Helen looked her over from head to toe, then set the laundry basket down on the counter and said, "Sit down." June said she was in a hurry. Helen said, "You're not in a hurry. You're avoiding. Sit down." June sat. Helen made tea. Not the cheap tea bags she drank every day, but the loose-leaf tea she kept in a tin box on the highest shelf, the kind she only brewed when there was something serious to talk about. She placed the cup in front of June, sat down on the other side of the counter, and looked at her with the eyes June had always thought had seen enough of life to no longer be surprised by anything. "You've lost weight," Helen said. "I haven't lost weight. You've visibly lost weight. Your eyes are darker than last month, and your hands are shaking." June looked down. Her hands were wrapped around the teacup, and Helen was right. Her fingers were trembling lightly against the hot porcelain, the kind of trembling she hadn't noticed until someone pointed it out. "You're in love with someone, aren't you?" Helen said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was flat, like she was reading the name on a laundry label. June said, "No." Helen took a sip of tea, set the cup down, and said nothing else for about 10 seconds. 10 seconds of Helen Cross's silence weighed more than 10 minutes of someone else speaking, because she used silence the way a carpenter used a wood clamp, holding something firmly in place until it could no longer run. "I'll tell you my story," Helen said. "You don't need to tell me yours. I just need you to listen." June neither nodded nor shook her head. Helen told her. When she was 32, she loved a man named Ray. Ray was a firefighter at Station 17 in Pilsen. He was handsome in the way a man can be when you know he'll wreck your life, but you still open the door every time he knocks. Ray was addicted to alcohol, not the kind of addiction people saw in movies, the kind where someone collapsed in the street and everyone knew. It was the kind where he still went to work every morning, still smiled at his coworkers, still carried people out of fires, but every night when he came home, he sat in the kitchen and drank until he wasn't Ray anymore. And Helen sat in the living room listening to the sound of the glass being set down on the table. One glass, then another, and she counted. Helen stayed for 7 years. 7 years she thought she could cure him. 7 years she made coffee for him every morning instead of letting him reach for the bottle. 7 years she hid bottles, poured bottles out, replaced bottles with water, cleaned up after every night, called his coworkers when he missed a shift, lied to doctors when he was hurt, and didn't remember when he had gotten hurt. 7 years she turned herself into the cushion between Ray and the ground, and every time he fell, she hurt in his place. "Then I left," Helen said. Her voice wasn't sad. Her voice was flat, the kind of flatness that belonged to someone who had told the story to herself enough times that it no longer had sharp edges, only the smoothness of a stone under a stream. "I left because one morning I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself. I had lost 20 pounds. My hair was falling out. My hands were shaking. I looked more like him than like myself. I had become him without knowing it." June said nothing. Her hands held the teacup, and she felt the warmth of the porcelain seeping through her skin, and she wondered why she could feel that warmth more clearly than usual, why everything lately was either too clear or too blurred, with nothing in between. 15 years after I walked away," Helen said, "I heard Ray had gotten sober. He did it himself. Not because of me, not because of anyone, because of himself. He made the decision himself, went to see the people he needed to see himself, did what needed to be done himself. 15 years of him fighting in the dark, years before I ended up here, running this laundromat at 62. She looked at June. "The lesson isn't, don't love someone who's broken, sweetheart. Don't let anyone teach you that, because that's a lie. People have the right to love whoever they want to love." She placed her hand over June's, light, warm, certain. "The lesson is that you aren't medicine. You're a person. If you turn yourself into medicine, you'll be swallowed until there's nothing left. And when you're empty, who's going to heal you?" June looked down at Helen's hand on hers. Helen was 62 years old, her hands calloused from soap and hot water, and 10 years of running industrial washing machines, but her hand was warm and steady and didn't shake. June wanted to say something. She wanted to say, "I don't love anyone," or "This isn't like that," or "I'm fine." But she looked at her own hand trembling around the teacup, and she said nothing, because she didn't know which one of those sentences was true. It began with sleep, or, more precisely, with the fact that there was no sleep left at all. June lay in bed every morning after her shift, closed her eyes, and nothing happened. It wasn't insomnia in the way her mind spun wildly with thoughts, not the kind of worry or fear that kept her awake. She simply lay there, eyes closed, body exhausted, and sleep didn't come, as if someone had turned off a switch somewhere inside her, and she couldn't find where to turn it back on. She lay there listening to the dryer running in the corner of the room, to Bread breathing steadily on the pillow beside her head, to the garbage truck passing by at 7 o'clock in the morning, to the children downstairs running out the door for school at 7:30, to the silence returning after that. And she lay through all those sounds with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, until afternoon sunlight slipped through the curtains, and it was time for her to get ready for work again. Then came eating. She didn't exactly stop eating. She forgot. She came home, sat down, meant to cook something, then looked out the window. And when she looked back at the clock, 3 hours had passed and she still hadn't stood up. Some days, she opened the refrigerator, looked inside, looked at the carton of eggs and the bottle of milk and the bag of wilted vegetables, then closed it again because she didn't feel hungry. It wasn't that she didn't want to eat. She didn't remember that she needed to eat. Her body grew visibly thinner. The jeans she wore to work began to loosen at her hips. Her collarbones stood out more clearly in the bathroom mirror, and she began drinking black coffee. She didn't know when it started. Maybe on the 20th night, or the 22nd. She couldn't remember exactly. She only knew that one afternoon she stood in the kitchen of her studio apartment, made coffee for herself before work, and she made it black, no sugar, no milk, poured it into a cup, took a sip, and didn't grimace. She had hated black coffee her whole life. She had always drunk coffee with 2 packets of sugar and powdered creamer, the kind of coffee Preston Shaw would probably call sugar water with the scent of coffee. But that afternoon, she made it black and drank it black, and didn't realize she was doing anything differently until Helen said something. Helen was standing in the doorway of the laundromat, holding the basket of clothes June had just dropped off, watching her walk toward the stairs with a cup of coffee in her hand, and she said, "Since when do you drink black coffee?" June looked down at the cup in her hand. Black coffee. No sugar. No milk. She looked at it and had no answer. She didn't know since when. She didn't remember deciding to change. She only knew that this was what she made every day now. What she carried up to the second floor of the alcove every night. What his fingers touched hers through the body of the cup, and now it was what she made for herself. In her own kitchen. Alone. Helen didn't say anything else. She only looked at June, then at the cup of coffee, then back at June. And there was something in her eyes that June didn't want to face. So she lowered her head, took the basket of clothes, and went up the stairs. Every night, when she left the alcove, when the back door closed behind her and the cold Chicago air rushed against her face, her chest began to ache. Not pain, nothing sharp, nothing stabbing, nothing she could point to and say, "It hurts here." It was like the ringing in her ears after a loud noise cut off, not painful but never quiet, not gone but not loud enough to scream over. Just there, constant, reminding her that something was missing, that something had just been cut out of her every time she stepped out of that room, and she didn't know what to name it, but it grew larger every night. Garrett called her in one evening before her shift, his voice brief as always, without a single extra word. "Mr. Shaw's private office cleaner quit. You'll replace them. Starting tonight. The room is at the end of the second floor hallway, the third door on the right after the VIP room. Clean it. Don't search. Don't read. Don't touch anything on the desk except trash and dirty glasses. Clear?" Clear. June didn't ask why it was her. She knew why. She was the person Garrett had watched for more than a month. The person who had been handed an envelope with $5,000 and hadn't taken it. The person who had been stopped in an alley by two strangers and hadn't told Preston. The person who held a coffee cup every night with steady hands and never looked too long at anything that wasn't her business. She was safe, not because she was loyal, but because she had been trained by her entire life not to see what she wasn't supposed to see. Preston Shaw's private office was smaller than she had imagined. She had pictured a room like the VIP room, a long table, leather chairs, yellow lamps, but this was only a narrow room. A dark wooden desk, a swivel chair, a nearly empty bookshelf, and a window facing the back alley with the curtains always drawn shut. On the desk sat a closed laptop, a pen placed sideways, and several envelopes stacked neatly in the right corner. June picked up the dirty coffee glass on the desk, wiped the desktop, dusted the bookshelf, and vacuumed the floor. Ordinary work. She was wiping the leg of the desk when the cloth caught on the handle of the bottom drawer. She pulled lightly to free it, and the drawer slid open. It wasn't locked. Or rather, it had been locked, but the latch hadn't caught all the way. The kind of latch left by someone who had closed it in a hurry and hadn't checked again. The drawer opened about 10 centimeters. June looked inside. She should have closed it. She knew she should have closed it. Garrett had been clear. Don't search, don't read, don't touch anything on the desk except trash and dirty glasses. But her eyes had already seen before her mind could order them not to look. A paperback book, the kind of cheap romance novel sold in used bookstores or gas stations, its cover showing two hands intertwined, bright colors in the kind of design people looked at once and then forgot. One corner of a page was folded, the kind of fold made by someone who didn't use a bookmark, the kind of fold made by someone planning to come back and keep reading. June looked at the page number in the folded corner. Page 214. Beneath the book was a Polaroid photograph. A young woman, probably in her early 20s, brown hair tied loosely, reading a book inside a car, streetlight shining in through the window, making alternating streaks of light and shadow across the open page in her hands. The photo had been taken from the driver's seat, slightly tilted, the kind of secret picture taken by the person sitting beside her, who didn't want her to look up. The girl in the photo was smiling faintly at the page, the kind of smile people have when they've just read something good and have no one to tell. June turned the photo over. On the back was handwriting in black ink, neat and slanted. Me, the last Tuesday. Beneath the photo, at the bottom of the drawer, was a newspaper clipping. The paper had yellowed at the edges, cut unevenly, the kind of cut made by hand without scissors. The headline was printed in bold, and she only read the first line before she forced herself to stop. A shooting at the South Chicago Harbor, dated 14 months earlier, with casualties. She closed the drawer. The latch still didn't catch all the way, exactly as it had been when she found it. She stood up, cleaning cloth in her hand, and looked at the envelopes in the corner of the desk. She didn't pick them up. She didn't need to. The recipient's address was printed clearly on the front in typed letters. An address in Gold Coast, penthouse floor. She finished cleaning the room. She turned off the light. She closed the door. She went out into the hallway and made the nighttime coffee for the VIP room like always. But that evening, after everyone had left, after the door had closed, after the room held only him and her and the desk lamp, June didn't set the second cup of coffee on the table. She set the Polaroid down, right in front of him. The brown-haired girl reading in the car, the streetlight across the page, the faint smile no one had seen. "Who is she?" June asked. Preston Shaw looked down at the photograph, and for the first time in all the nights June had sat in this room, in all the moments she had touched his hand through the body of a coffee cup, in all the calmness and flatness and perfect control he held in front of everyone, including her, his hands shook, both hands, on the tabletop, shaking clearly enough that she could see his knuckles tremble lightly against the dark wood. He didn't look up. He didn't answer. He only looked at the photograph, and his hands shook. And the room was so silent June could hear the clock on the wall behind him, ticking, 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 and she understood that she had just touched something larger than anything she had touched before, larger than the coffee cup, larger than fingers, larger even than the 2 words "don't pull away" that he had said on the first night, and she didn't know whether she was ready for it yet. Preston didn't answer June's question that night. He looked at the Polaroid on the table until June picked it up herself, put it back into the drawer, and left the room without saying another word. She knew she had pushed too far. She knew because of the way he sat after she asked, his back stiff, his shoulders locked, as if his entire body had just closed into an iron door, and she was standing outside that door holding a cold cup of coffee with no idea what to do. 3 nights later, she made the coffee, brought it up to the second floor, set the cup down, and for the first time in more than a month, his fingers didn't touch hers. He took the cup by waiting until she had pulled her hand away first, and only then did he reach for it. A small distance, maybe only 1 second, but June felt it as clearly as she would feel the temperature in a room dropping. Then, on the 4th night after the photograph, she came to the alcove, and something was wrong. She knew it before she stepped through the employee entrance. There were 2 black cars parked in the back alley that usually weren't there. The employee door wasn't locked, though it was always locked. And when she walked in, the kitchen was empty. The bar was empty. The entire first floor was empty. None of the men under him were sitting at the corner table drinking while waiting for the meeting hour the way they did every night. Her phone vibrated. A message from Garrett's number, but it wasn't sent by Garrett. "Tonight's shift is canceled. Go home. Don't come to the alcove until further notice." June stood in the empty kitchen, read the message twice, then opened her phone and searched the news. She didn't need to search for long. The local station's night bulletin was running a red banner across the bottom of the screen. "Shooting outside upscale restaurant The. 1 man critically injured, taken to Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Police are investigating. 1 man. No name given." But June knew. She knew because the message had come from Garrett's number but hadn't been sent by Garrett. Because if Garrett had been able to send the message, Garrett wouldn't be the one lying in an ambulance. She stood in the alcove's kitchen for another 10 seconds. Then she turned off her phone, locked the employee door behind her, and took a taxi to Northwestern Memorial. She found Preston in the 4th floor hallway, outside surgery, sitting on a blue plastic chair beneath white fluorescent lights. He sat completely motionless, his back straight, both hands resting on his thighs, his eyes fixed on the wall across from him. He was wearing a white shirt that was no longer white. Garrett's blood was on his cuffs, on the backs of his hands, between his fingers, dried to a dark brown at the edges, and still a deep red in his palms. He hadn't wiped it off. He hadn't looked down at his hands. On his left wrist, above the bloodstain, was a white-faced Patek Philippe watch, with a dark brown leather strap, worn thin at the buckle hole. The kind of watch someone who didn't know would think was ordinary, and someone who did know would understand was worth as much as an apartment. He wore it every day. His father had left it to him, and he couldn't feel its weight on his wrist, just as he couldn't feel the dried blood pulling at the skin of his hands, just as he couldn't feel the cold plastic chair against his back, just as he was sitting here in a hospital hallway, while the person closest to him was on an operating table, and he couldn't feel anything at all. No fear, no anger, no pain, nothing. And right when he needed to feel the most, inside him was an empty room. June said nothing. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't ask whether Garrett was all right. She didn't say, "I'm here." She went into the restroom at the end of the hallway, took 3 paper towels, wet them under warm water, wrung out the extra water, and came back. She pulled the second plastic chair over and sat across from him. She took his right hand, gently, lifted it, and began to clean it. Finger by finger, she cleaned his thumb first, wiping from the first joint down to the fingertip, wiping away the dried blood in the crease between his thumb and index finger, then the index finger, then the middle finger, slowly, without hurry, the way Mrs. Morrison had once cleaned June's hand after June peeled potatoes for the first time and cut her finger, slowly, carefully, not saying, "Be careful," only cleaning the wound, putting on a bandage, handing the knife back to her, and saying, "Keep peeling, ring finger, little finger." She turned his hand over, cleaned his palm, wiped along the lines of his hand where blood had settled into thin streaks in the folds of his skin, and when she reached his wrist, just beneath the edge of the watch his father had left him, her finger pressed lightly into his skin, and Preston Shaw, the man who had been sitting motionless in the hospital hallway like a cast statue, drew in a breath, small, short, but real. He looked down at his hand. He looked at her finger on his wrist, the damp paper towel, the warmth from the water and the warmth from her skin, the light pressure of her finger against the pulse in his wrist. He could feel it, and tears fell, not sobbing, no sound, only water, spilling from his blue-gray eyes, running down his cheekbones, falling onto the open palm she had just cleaned. Not because of Garrett. Whether Garrett would live or not, he didn't know, and he was afraid, but he couldn't feel that fear. It was somewhere inside him, locked in the empty room where he had lived for many months. The tears fell for something else, for her finger on his wrist, for that small and specific warmth, because in all the emptiness, her hand was still the only crack where light could get through, and every time she touched him, that crack widened a little more, and he didn't know whether he wanted it to widen or feared it widening, but the tears had already fallen, and he didn't wipe them away because he could feel them on his skin heavy, burning, and undeniably real proof of a heart that refused to turn to stone. Garrett lived. June knew because she called the hospital every day for the first 3 days, each time introducing herself as a distant cousin, each time receiving exactly one sentence. "The patient is stable." On the 4th day, she stopped calling, because she understood that stable was all she would ever be allowed to know, and asking more would push her into territory where she shouldn't stand. 2 weeks passed. The alcove closed with the reason given as maintenance. June didn't go to work. She received no calls from Garrett, no calls from Preston, no messages, no envelopes, nothing at all. 2 weeks of silence. The heavy kind of silence. The kind she knew didn't mean people had forgotten her, but that people were deciding what to do with her. She was used to that kind of silence. It was like the silence between 2 calls from social services, when one foster family had returned her and the next family hadn't yet taken her in, and she sat in the waiting room with her bag on her lap, waiting for someone to decide where she would go. During those 2 weeks, June lived more slowly than usual. She slept more, not because she could sleep, but because she had no reason to stay awake. She fed bread on time. She did her laundry at Helen's laundromat. She bought instant noodles and eggs and milk. She read the Oxford Dictionary, opening it to the page with the word severance, finishing the entry, then closing it without opening another page. And every afternoon, at 4 o'clock, she stood in the kitchen and made coffee. Black, no sugar, no milk. And she drank it while standing by the window, looking down at the street, and she thought nothing, and she felt nothing, and that was what frightened her most. The call came on the 15th day. Garrett's number, June answered, and Garrett's voice on the other end was weaker than she remembered, thinner, the kind of voice that belonged to someone speaking from a hospital bed and trying to keep it from shaking. "Miss Bellamy," he said, "I'm calling to inform you. Your employment contract at the alcove is terminated as of today. Your final month's salary has been transferred to your account. You'll receive an additional 2 months' pay as compensation. There's no need to come collect your belongings. We'll send them to your address." Silence. June held the phone, standing in the middle of the kitchen, looking out the window. The pale gold Chicago afternoon sunlight lay across the front of the building opposite hers. Bread lay on the dryer, one eye open, watching her. "Miss Bellamy?" Garrett said. "Can you hear me clearly?" "Who decided?" June asked. She knew the answer. She asked because she wanted to hear Garrett say it. "Mr. Shaw?" Garrett said. Nothing more. No explanation. "Not for your safety. Not he's doing this for you. Just 2 words. Mr. Shaw." Then Garrett said, "I wish you all the best." And he hung up. June set the phone down on the kitchen table. She stood there a little longer. Then she walked to the sofa, sat down, and bread jumped from the dryer, climbed into her lap, and curled up. She placed her hand on the cat's back and stared straight ahead. On the kitchen table, beside the phone, was the cup of coffee she had just made. Black. No sugar, no milk. The coffee she had hated her whole life, until she no longer hated it. Until it became something she drank every day without realizing it, until it became what she made for him every night, and now made for herself every afternoon. She looked at that cup of coffee, and understood that he was inside her more deeply than she had thought. Not in her head, not in her thoughts. In her habits, in her body, in the way she made coffee, in the way she stayed awake, in the way she kept silent, in the way she lay with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling until morning, exactly the way he had sat staring at the hospital wall that night. He had cut her out. Coldly, quickly, through the phone, through Garrett's voice, not his own. She understood why. Garrett had almost lost his life. Someone had realized Preston Shaw had a weakness, and everything close to him became a target. And she stood closest to him out of everyone who didn't carry a weapon. He was protecting her in the only way he knew how. The way of a man who had spent his whole life in a world where protecting someone meant pushing them away fast enough to make them hate him, because hate made leaving easier, and leaving meant safety. She understood. She understood completely. And she didn't accept it. She waited 2 days, not because she needed time to think. She had known she would go from the moment Garrett hung up. She waited because she wanted to be sure that when she went, she would go with a clear mind, not with anger. Anger would burn and then go out. Clarity would stay. At 2:00 in the morning on the 17th day, June put on her coat, locked the door of her studio, and took a taxi to Gold Coast. She remembered the address on the envelope in the corner of his office desk. The typed letters, clean and clear, carved into her mind since the night she found the Polaroid. She had never been to Gold Coast at 2:00 in the morning. She had never been to Gold Coast at any hour. This neighborhood wasn't meant for people like her. A neighborhood of tall glass buildings lit all night, with doormen standing outside, marble lobbies, and private elevators that went straight up to the penthouse. It was raining. Chicago rain in December. Cold, fine, not heavy enough to be called a storm, but enough to soak her hair in the time it took her to walk from the taxi to the building entrance. The night guard sat behind the lobby desk, a middle-aged man in a black uniform, looking her over from head to toe with a look she was used to receiving, the look of someone deciding whether she belonged in a place like this. And the answer was clearly no. "I need to see Mr. Shaw," June said. "Penthouse." The guard didn't blink. "Mr. Shaw doesn't receive visitors who aren't on the list. Do you have an appointment?" "No." "Then I can't let you up." "Call him," June said. Her voice was calm, not because she felt calm, but because she had spent 2 days practicing how to make it sound that way. "Tell him June Bellamy is standing in the lobby, shivering and damp from the rain, and she won't leave until he opens the door or sends someone to drag me outside." The guard looked at her for another 3 seconds, then picked up the internal phone, dialed, and spoke quietly into the receiver. She couldn't hear what he said. She stood in the middle of the lobby, wet hair sticking to her forehead, her coat damp, her old shoes leaving wet marks on the marble, and she waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, long enough for her to start thinking he really might send someone to drag her out, that she would end up standing on the sidewalk at 2:15 in the morning under Chicago rain, with no taxi and no way home, except walking to the night bus stop 9 blocks away. Then the elevator opened. Preston Shaw stepped out, and she almost didn't recognize him. Not because he had changed so much, but because she had never seen him like this. He was always sitting in darkness. In the VIP room, in the office, in the hospital hallway under bluish fluorescent lights. She had never seen him standing under bright lights, close enough for her to see every detail of his face that darkness had once hidden. His hair was messy, not the intentional kind of messy, but the kind that belonged to someone who had been lying in bed without sleeping and hadn't bothered to comb it when he got up. His shirt was wrinkled, the same shirt he had worn at the hospital or a different one. She didn't know, but it was wrinkled in a way Preston Shaw's clothes were never wrinkled. And his face. Under the lobby lights, she saw that his nose leaned slightly to the right, very faintly, the kind of crookedness left by a bone that had once been broken and never set properly, something she could never have seen in the darkness of the VIP room. But here, 2 meters away from him, beneath white light, it was clear, and the shadows under his eyes were deeper than they had been 2 weeks ago, so deep they looked like old bruises, and she understood that firing her hadn't made him better. Firing her had taken away the only thing still keeping him above water. He looked at her. She looked at him. The guard behind the desk pretended to look somewhere else. "You don't get to do this," June said. Her voice didn't shake. Her voice was hard and clear, and she spoke each word as if laying down one brick at a time. "You don't get to use me and throw me away the way everyone else has done my whole life. I'm the only person in this world who can touch you and make you feel it. And you fired me over the phone, through Garrett's voice, while Garrett was lying in a hospital bed because of you. You made a man who had just almost lost his life call me and dismiss me because you didn't have the courage to say it yourself." Preston didn't argue. He didn't explain. He didn't say, "I did it for you." He stood there, in the brightly lit lobby, hair messy, shirt wrinkled, nose slightly crooked, eyes dark with exhaustion, and he took every word she said like a blow he didn't raise his hands to block. Then he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, "Because if I saw you while saying it, I wouldn't have been able to say it." One sentence. No defense, no apology, only the truth, bare and simple. He wasn't strong enough to look at her and sever ties at the same time, because he had tried to distance himself without looking, and even then, he had almost failed. June stood beneath the lobby lights, hair wet, shoes dirty, and she looked at the most powerful man in Chicago, standing in front of her, with the eyes of someone who had just surrendered. He stepped aside. He didn't say, "Come in." He didn't need to. He only stepped aside, and the elevator doors stayed open behind him, and she walked past him into the elevator, and he stepped in after her, and the doors closed, and they stood beside each other as the elevator rose toward the penthouse floor, saying nothing, not touching, with only its steady hum and the breathing of 2 people stepping into something they both knew could never be undone. Preston Shaw's penthouse was nothing like anything June had imagined. She had pictured expensive furniture, paintings on the walls, the kind of luxury she had only seen in movies, but the apartment was almost empty. A wide living room, dark wooden floors, 1 sofa set, 1 low table, no paintings, no photographs, nothing on the walls except white paint, like a place where no one lived, or a place where someone lived but had stopped seeing the space around him a very long time ago. Preston sat down at one end of the sofa. June sat at the other. The distance between them was wide enough to fit one more person, and neither of them closed it. Silence lasted for a very long time. June didn't ask again. She had already asked that question, the night she placed the Polaroid on the table. Who is she? She didn't need to ask a second time. She only needed to wait. Then Preston spoke, and his voice didn't sound like any voice she had ever heard from him. Not the flat voice of the VIP room, not the rough voice from the first night, not the whisper in the lobby just now. This voice was different. This voice sounded like someone opening a room they had locked for a very long time, and the hinges were rusted, and every word had to push through that rust to get out. "My sister," he said. "Merritt." He stopped at the name, stopped like a man who had just spoken aloud a word he had only whispered inside his own head for months. And hearing it in the air was different. It had weight. It had shape. It was real. Merritt was 22, he said. She was in her final year of college. Education. She wanted to teach elementary school. 3rd grade. He looked down at his hands in his lap. She said 3rd grade is the year children start believing they aren't good enough. She said there's a moment during the 3rd grade year. She didn't know exactly when it happens. But one day, a child wakes up and starts comparing themselves to other children, and if no one is there to tell them they're all right, then they'll believe they aren't all right for the rest of their life. She wanted to be the person who was there. June listened. She said nothing. She sat at one end of the sofa and listened, and let him speak at his own rhythm. One sentence at a time, one piece at a time, like someone peeling a bandage away from a wound when each layer stuck to the skin and every pull hurt. But he kept pulling anyway. She liked reading in the car, he said. Every time I went to work at night, she sat in the passenger seat and read. She said the streetlights made a rhythm of light and dark while the car moved, and that rhythm helped her focus. I bought her 10 bookmarks in 3 years. She didn't use a single one. She folded the corners of the pages. I asked why, and she said only people who believe they'll come back fold page corners. He stopped, longer than before. June saw his jaw clench and release, as if he were chewing the next word, but it had gotten stuck somewhere between his chest and his throat. There was one night, he said, a deal at the South Harbor. I had a man. The closest one to me, closer than Garrett. His name was Whelan. I trusted him. I trusted him like a brother. His voice flattened again, intentionally flat. The kind of flatness belonging to a man controlling every muscle in his face, so he wouldn't break in the middle of the sentence. Whelan betrayed me. He sold information. He arranged an ambush at the harbor that night. There were losses. He stopped. Merritt was sitting in the car, passenger seat. She was reading a book. She had nothing to do with anything I did. She was only sitting there waiting for me to go to dinner, because I told her I was going to dinner. He stared straight ahead, at the blank white wall across the living room. She never left the car. Silence. June felt the air in the room grow heavier, as if gravity had just increased, and she had to breathe on purpose so she wouldn't forget how. 3 days later, Preston said, I found Whelan. He knew I would come. He got down on his knees. He surrendered. Silence. That didn't change the outcome. He didn't say anything more about Whelan. He didn't need to. June understood, and she understood that this was the thing eating him from the inside, not Merritt's death, even though that was the deepest wound, but what he had done afterward, the thing that, once he was finished doing it, made something inside him look in the mirror and no longer recognize itself. And his brain had shut everything down, because if it hadn't shut down, he would have had to face the question he didn't dare answer. What kind of man am I? Every night I go back to the harbor, he said. His voice was very soft now, almost a whisper, like the voice he used when the VIP room was empty, and he said, This cup has gone cold, Miss Bellamy. The kind of voice meant only for her, only for the moments when no one else could hear. Every night when I close my eyes, I'm there. I hear the glass breaking. I see the book falling from her hands, and there's a voice, in my own voice, saying over and over again, You knew that night was dangerous. You still let your sister sit in the car. You told her you were going to dinner. You lied to your sister, and she died because of that lie. Tears ran down his face. It wasn't the first time June had seen him cry. She had seen it in the hospital hallway. But that time the tears had fallen silently, almost unconsciously, like something spilling out against his will. This time was different. This time he knew he was crying, and he didn't wipe them away. He let the tears run down his cheekbones, down his jaw, down his neck, and he didn't lift a hand to wipe them off because he could feel them. Warm, wet, real, moving over his skin and inside all the emptiness he had lived in. Tears were proof that something inside him hadn't completely died, and he didn't want to wipe that proof away. After the tears stopped, Preston sat still for a while, breathing slowly. Then he stood without saying anything and went into the inner room. June sat on the sofa, listening to the sound of a drawer opening, the rustle of paper, then the sound of his footsteps returning. He was holding a sheet of paper, handwritten paper, the kind torn from a notebook, with spiral holes along the edge, the kind of paper students used for taking notes in a lecture hall. The paper had been folded into 4, the creases worn soft, the kind of folds belonging to something that had been opened and read, then folded back up, then opened and read, then folded back up many times. He sat down, holding the paper with both hands, and he looked at it for a while before speaking. They found it in her backpack, he said, at the dorm, after the funeral. She wrote it to me but hadn't sent it. Maybe she meant to send it. Maybe she didn't. I don't know. He opened the paper, and June saw handwriting in blue ink, rounded and slanted. The handwriting of someone who wrote quickly but carefully. The handwriting of someone who wanted to be clear even though she knew the reader might never read it. Preston read. His voice was slow, word by word, and every word had to be pushed out of his mouth, like something heavy being forced through a narrow door. P. I know you won't read this because you don't read letters. You only call and hang up after 40 seconds. You think 40 seconds is enough to ask whether I'm all right, and hear me say I'm all right. You don't know that every time you hang up, I still hold the phone to my ear for another 10 seconds because I haven't finished talking. He stopped, breathed in, read on. But I want to say it. Even if you don't read it, you don't need to pretend to be strong in front of me. I know you're afraid. I'm afraid too, but I'm more afraid for you than for myself. I'm afraid that one day you'll forget how to be afraid. And a person who forgets how to be afraid also forgets how to be careful. And a person who forgets how to be careful will lose something they can't get back. He stopped, longer this time. His fingers gripped the edge of the paper tightly, and June saw the paper tremble with his hands. I'm all right. I want you to be all right too. Merritt. He folded the paper again, 4 folds, along the same old creases. He placed it on the table between them, and silence followed. June looked at the folded paper on the table. She thought of the girl in the Polaroid, brown hair tied loosely back, smiling at a book page under the streetlight. The girl who wanted to teach 3rd grade because that was the year children started believing they weren't good enough. The girl who kept the phone to her ear for another 10 seconds after her brother hung up because she hadn't finished talking. The girl who wrote a letter to someone she knew wouldn't read it, and still wrote it, because writing was how she loved, even if the person receiving it didn't receive it. She knew, June said. Her voice was soft, but it didn't shake. She always knew who you were. She saw you more clearly than you saw yourself. And she still sat in that car every night reading, because she felt safe there. That trust wasn't wrong. Nothing she believed about you was wrong. Preston said nothing. He sat with both hands resting on his thighs, looking at the folded paper on the table. And he said nothing. But June saw his shoulders lower, only by a few millimeters, the way a person's shoulders lower when they have just set down something they have carried for far too long. Not all the way yet, but they have begun to set it down. The silence stretched. Then June said, "Can I tell you something?" Preston looked at her. He nodded, small. June pulled up her left sleeve. 3 old scars on the inside of her arm, pale, almost blended into her skin, but still there if someone looked closely. Still there if someone knew where to look. She didn't hold out her arm for him to see, as if she were displaying it. She only pulled up her sleeve, left her hand resting on her own thigh, and spoke. "I didn't grow up somewhere safe," she said. "There were people who were supposed to protect me, and they didn't. This is what I carry from that time." She looked down at her arm, then looked up. "It took me a very long time to understand that it wasn't my fault. A very long time. Longer than I want to admit. But I did understand it. And I'm telling you not because I want you to pity me, or because I want you to be angry for me, or because I want you to do anything. I'm telling you because you just showed me your wound, and I want you to know that I have one too, and I'm still here." Preston looked at her arm. Then he looked at her face, and he didn't say, "I'll find out who did that." He didn't say, "I'll protect you." He didn't promise anything he wasn't sure he could keep. He said, his voice quiet, simple, with nothing behind it except the exact meaning of each word. "Thank you for telling me." And June understood that it was the first time he had treated her not as someone who needed protecting, not as a medical exception, not as the girl who made coffee and whom he needed in order to feel the table beneath his hand, but as a person, equal to him, with her own wounds, her own story, her own reason for being here, and that reason was no less heavy than his. They both sat on the sofa, one at each end, Merritt's letter lying between them on the table, and the room was silent, but this time the silence wasn't heavy. It was light. It was like the silence of 2 people who had just set something down together and were sitting for a moment to rest before they went on. June stayed at the penthouse that night. Preston brought her a blanket and a pillow, placed them at one end of the sofa, said nothing more, then went into the inner room and closed the door. She lay on the sofa in the almost empty living room, staring up at the high ceiling, listening to the Chicago wind beyond the glass, and she slept. Not a deep sleep, but sleep. Something she had almost forgotten how it felt. And when she opened her eyes, morning had come, and Preston was no longer in the apartment. No note, no message. She folded the blanket, set the pillow on top, and left. She took the bus back to the south side. She opened the door of her studio. Brett looked at her from the dryer with the judgmental stare of a cat who had been left hungry for 12 hours. She fed Brett, then went into the kitchen, and she made coffee. Her hands moved automatically, without passing through her mind, the way her hands mopped floors or wrung out towels or folded bedsheets, the kind of motion the body remembered in place of the mind. She poured the coffee into a cup. Black, no sugar, no milk. She lifted the cup to her mouth, took a sip, and the bitterness spread over her tongue, and she froze. She lowered the cup. She looked into it. Black. No sugar. No milk. Then she looked around the kitchen. She looked at the bed in the corner of the room, the blanket still neatly folded, because she hadn't slept in that bed for many nights. She looked at the Oxford Dictionary on the bedside table, lying open face down, the page open to the word Sonder, the word he had read, not the word she had chosen. She looked down at the clothes she was wearing. A dark t-shirt, dark pants. She had always worn light-colored clothes before, not because she liked them, but because light-colored clothes were cheaper at the thrift store. But lately she had been buying dark clothes. Lately she had been wearing black. Lately she had been drinking black coffee without sugar and lying awake staring at the ceiling until morning and forgetting to eat and growing thinner and trembling when she held a cup of tea at Helen's laundromat. She was turning into him, and Helen's words rang in her head, clear, exact, in Helen's voice, in the way Helen had placed her hand over June's at the laundromat counter. You aren't medicine. You're a person. If you turn yourself into medicine, you'll be swallowed until there's nothing left. She set the coffee cup down in the sink. She opened the refrigerator, took out the milk, poured coffee into a new cup, added 2 packets of sugar, and stirred. She drank. Sweet. Familiar. Hers. Then she went to sleep. She slept for 16 hours. When she woke, the sky had already turned dark and then light again. She ate. Not instant noodles. She walked to the grocery store 2 blocks away, bought eggs, bought bread, bought butter, and came home to make eggs fried in butter, the way Mrs. Morrison had taught her, with twice as much butter as she thought was enough. She ate slowly, bite by bite, and she could taste every bite. On the second day, she walked out to Lake Michigan. It was late December, and the lake shore was cutting cold, the wind blowing off the water straight into the bones, and she sat on a wooden bench, looking out over the silver-gray lake, and she didn't think about Preston Shaw. She thought about herself. She thought about June Bellamy, 28 years old, sitting on a bench beside Lake Michigan, alive, breathing, still able to taste the salt in the wind, and she wondered when the last time was that she had thought about herself, only herself, not anyone else. She couldn't remember. On the third day, she did laundry at Helen's. Helen looked at her, looked at the cup of coffee with milk and sugar in her hand, and said nothing. But she nodded. A small nod. The kind of nod from someone seeing what she had hoped to see. Preston didn't call. No messages. No one waited outside her studio door. No black car parked at the end of the street. No call from Garrett. 3 days of complete silence. And June knew it was the hardest thing he had ever done. Harder than sitting in the dark without feeling anything. Harder than talking about Merritt. Harder than crying in front of her. Because Preston Shaw was a man who controlled everything. Everyone. Every outcome. That was how he lived. How he survived. How he kept himself and the people around him safe. Or at least how he believed he did. And now she had left. And he didn't know whether she would come back. And instead of calling, instead of looking for her, instead of sending someone to follow her, he did nothing at all. For the first time in his life, he let someone leave without trying to keep them, without trying to control them, without trying to decide for them where they should be. And that was the first step of growth. Truly the first, not of the mafia boss, but of the man inside the mafia boss. On the 4th day, at 2 o'clock in the morning, June pushed open the back door of the alcove. The door wasn't locked. The kitchen lights were on, dim, exactly the level of light for a night shift. The coffee machine at the second-floor counter still had water in it, still had ground coffee in the container, as if someone had known she would come back, or as if someone had hoped and hadn't dared admit he was hoping. She made coffee. Black. No sugar. No milk. She made it for him, not for herself. At home, she had gone back to drinking coffee with milk and sugar from the first day. And that small difference, which cup was hers and which cup was his, was the thing she had spent 3 days sitting beside Lake Michigan trying to find again. She carried the cup up to the second floor. The VIP room door was open. The desk lamp was on. Preston sat at the head of the table, in the same place as before, and when she stepped inside and saw him, the first thing she realized was that he was thinner after those weeks. Or maybe he had already been thin before, and she hadn't noticed, because she was used to seeing him in darkness, and darkness hid many things. He looked at her. She looked at him. She walked to the table, set the coffee cup down on his right side, and withdrew her hand before his fingers could touch hers. She placed the cup down, then stepped back once, then twice, both hands resting at her sides, standing farther from him than she had ever stood on any night before. Preston looked at the coffee cup, then at Hare, then at the space between the cup and her hand, the space that hadn't existed before. "Why are you standing farther away?" he asked. His voice was calm, but his eyes weren't. His eyes were asking another question, the one he didn't say aloud. "Why did you come back and still stand farther away? Why are you here and still not touching me? Are you here because of me or because of something else? And if it's because of something else, what is it? And what does it mean for me, for you, for the steaming black coffee on the table between us? Because I'm learning how to stand beside you without disappearing inside you," June said. She said it calmly. She had practiced that sentence in her head for 3 days. Not practicing the words, but practicing how to say them without trembling, how to say them while looking straight into his eyes, how to say them without apologizing for them. Preston was silent. He looked at her, and she saw him understand, not with his mind, but with something deeper, something he perhaps couldn't name. Yet it was there on his face, in the way his shoulders lowered, in the way he didn't reach for the cup, didn't reach for her. "I didn't try to close the distance she had just placed between them. You didn't have to come back," he said, not pushing her away. She could hear the difference. Last time, he had pushed her away by firing her through Garrett's phone call, cold, decisive, giving her no choice. This time, he said you didn't have to, and he left the sentence open. He let it be a truth instead of an order. He said she didn't have to be here, and he let her decide for herself whether she wanted to be here. "I know," June said. "That's why I came back." And she saw him understand. She had come back not because he needed her. She had come back because she had left, had proven she could live without him, had slept for 16 hours, had eaten eggs fried in butter, had drunk coffee with milk and sugar, had sat beside Lake Michigan and thought about herself, only herself. And after all of that, she still chose to come back. Not because of dependence, because of freedom. Because only a free person can choose. And she was choosing. That week, June made coffee every night, set the cup down, pulled her hand away, and stepped back. Preston drank the coffee alone. He didn't hold her hand around the body of the cup. He didn't ask her to stay longer. He sat in the VIP room after everyone left, and instead of resting his forehead against her wrist, he sat with himself, inside the emptiness he had spent months running from by using her hand as a life raft. And without the raft, he sank, not sinking like drowning, sinking like touching the bottom. And when he touched the bottom, he did the thing he had refused to do for 14 months. He called Dr. Priya Nolan. She was the psychologist Garrett had found for him 3 months after the night at the harbor. He had met her 3 times and then stopped, because she asked him questions he didn't want to answer. And he was Preston Shaw. And Preston Shaw didn't sit in a chair answering anyone's questions. But now he called. He made an appointment. He went to 1 session, then 2, then 3. June didn't ask what he said in the doctor's office. He didn't tell her. She didn't need to know. She only needed to know that every week, he left the alcove on Wednesday afternoon and came back with his eyes slightly red and his shoulders a little lower than usual. And he said nothing about it, but he went, steadily, every week, and that was enough. After the 3rd therapy session, Preston Shaw returned to the penthouse at 6 o'clock in the evening. He closed the door, took off his shoes, and realized he could feel the cold wooden floor beneath his feet. Not clearly, not the way he used to, but it was there, faint, like hearing a song from very far away and catching only a few notes, enough to know there was music, not enough yet to hear the melody. He stood in the middle of the living room for a while, barefoot on the wood, and he didn't move, because he was afraid that if he moved, the feeling would disappear, the way someone fears that if they open their eyes, a beautiful dream will dissolve. Then he went into the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator, took out an apple, and bit into it. He chewed slowly. He couldn't taste anything clearly, but there was something at the edge of his tongue, a shadow of flavor, like the shadow of an object rather than the object itself. But it was there. He finished the apple. He ate it standing in the kitchen, barefoot, alone. And it was the first meal in a very long time that he ate not because he needed fuel, but because he wanted to know whether he could taste it. That night, he lay down in bed. He didn't expect to sleep. He had stopped expecting that a long time ago, because hoping and then being disappointed was worse than not hoping at all. He lay on the bed, closed his eyes, listened to the city below, the cars, the wind, the living sound of Chicago at night, and waited for the harbor to come. It always came. Every night, when he closed his eyes long enough, the harbor appeared. The sound of glass breaking rang out. The book fell from Merritt's hands, and his own voice began speaking inside his head, and he stayed there until morning. But that night, the dream was different. He was in the car, driver's seat, and Merritt was sitting in the passenger seat. But there was no harbor, no dark night, no blinding headlights or footsteps outside the car, or anything he had seen hundreds of times across hundreds of nights. Only the car, and the streetlights outside making a rhythm of light and dark through the window, and Merritt reading a book, the cheap romance novel with two intertwined hands on the cover. She was sitting with her legs tucked up on the seat, the way she always sat, her head slightly tilted, brown hair falling over one shoulder, and she was turning a page. Not hurried, not afraid. Her fingers folded the corner of the page she had just finished, the kind of folded corner that made Preston buy her 10 bookmarks she never used, and she turned to a new page. She didn't look up. She didn't look at him. Not because she didn't know he was there, but because she did know. She knew he was sitting right beside her, and she didn't need to look up to confirm it, because she had always believed he was there. Always. Even when he wasn't worthy of that trust. She only turned the page, peacefully. Preston woke at 5 o'clock in the morning. The bedroom was dim, streetlight slipping through the curtains, and he lay there for a while, eyes open, and he could feel the blanket on his chest. Heavy, warm, real. He could feel the pillow beneath his head. He could feel the cold air on his face, and the warmth beneath the blanket, and the difference between those two things. And he lay there and breathed, and with every breath he could feel his chest rise and fall, and he tried to remember the last time he had felt this many things at once, and he couldn't remember. He reached for the phone on the bedside table. He called June. 5 o'clock in the morning. The phone rang 4 times. She answered, her voice heavy with sleep. The voice of someone woken in the middle of rest, but not angry because she was used to being woken in the middle of rest. The voice of someone who had worked the night shift all her life. June, he said, and she knew something was different because he called her by her name. Not Miss Bellamy. June. I dreamed about Merritt, he said. A short silence on the other end. She was listening. She always listened. She was reading, he said, in the car. The streetlights were still going light, dark, light, dark. She didn't look up. She only turned the page. His voice didn't shake. His voice was calm, the kind of calm that belonged to someone who had just passed through a storm and was standing on the other side, looking back. It was the first time I dreamed of her without the sound of glass breaking. Silence. Then June said, her voice still sleepy, but every word clear. That's because she knows you're all right now. Preston didn't say anything else. June didn't say anything else. Both of them held the phone to their ears for a few more seconds. The way Merritt used to hold the phone to her ear for 10 more seconds after her brother hung up, because there are things that don't need to be spoken aloud, only known by the fact that the person on the other end is still there. Then June said, "Go back to sleep." And he said, "All right." And they both hung up. The nightmares didn't disappear. In the nights that followed, sometimes the harbor still came, the glass still broke, the book still fell. But not every night anymore, and on the nights when it didn't come, Merritt sat in the car and turned the page, and she didn't look up, and that was enough. Healing isn't erasing the past. Healing is changing the relationship with the past. And when Merritt in the dream stopped dropping the book and began turning the page, that was when Preston Shaw began to understand that setting something down wasn't the same as forgetting, and remembering didn't have to hurt. 2 years later, June Bellamy woke at 6 o'clock in the morning in a 2-floor house by Lake Michigan, 40 minutes by car from Chicago, and she lay there a little longer, listening to the waves striking the stone shore behind the house. Not a mansion, not a castle. A house with a back porch overlooking the water, a kitchen wide enough for 2 people to stand side by side and cook, and a living room with bookshelves. June was slowly filling, one book after another, one book every week, because now she bought new books to expand her world beyond the old dictionary. Preston lay beside her, his face turned into the pillow, breathing evenly. He still woke in the middle of the night sometimes, and sometimes she heard him draw in a sharp breath inside a dream, and she knew the harbor was coming back. But not every night anymore, and on the nights when the harbor came, he woke, lay still, breathed, and then went back to sleep. He didn't need her to wake him. He didn't need her to hold his hand. He returned to sleep on his own, and that was what Dr. Priya Nolan called progress, and what Preston called a little better, and both of them were right. He was still connected to the Shaw organization. This story doesn't pretend he left everything behind for love, because life isn't a fairy tale, and real people don't change completely just because they meet the right person. But he had handed most of the operations over to Garrett, who had recovered fully after 6 months, with a new scar he jokingly called a medal, and his fingers didn't tremble when he held coffee anymore, or at least he had become better at hiding it. The organization's operations were slowly moving toward legitimacy, step by step, not because Preston Shaw had suddenly become a good man, but because he had begun to understand that the way he had lived before was the way of someone who wasn't afraid of losing anything, and now he had something to lose, and that changed every calculation. June took evening classes at community college, 3 courses each semester, in no hurry. She didn't know what she wanted to study, and she wasn't in a hurry to know. She only knew that every Tuesday and Thursday evening, she sat in a classroom with other adults who were also starting over, and she wrote notes in blue ink on notebook paper, and she felt the world growing wider than the 4 walls she had once lived within. Bread slept on the new dryer. It didn't shake like the old one, but bread still lay on it because habit was stronger than logic, and June understood that better than anyone. Helen called every Sunday. She never asked about Preston. She asked what June had eaten, how many hours she had slept, what book she was reading, whether the cat was healthy. She asked small questions because she knew small questions were the most accurate way to measure a life. Every morning, June woke before Preston. She went into the kitchen and made 2 cups of coffee, 1 black, without sugar, for him, 1 with milk and 2 packets of sugar for her. She set his cup down on the kitchen table, and when he came out, hair messy, eyes still heavy with sleep, he picked up the cup, and his fingers touched hers on the handle. 2 seconds. Like the first night at the alcove, when she set the coffee cup down on his right side, and their fingers touched for the first time. Only now, both of them knew it wasn't an accident, and both of them knew 2 seconds were enough. On the bookshelf in the living room, beside the new books June had bought, sat the battered old Oxford Dictionary with its dark blue cover yellowed by time, and beside it, the cheap romance novel, with 2 intertwined hands on the cover, open to page 214, its corner folded. Preston didn't continue reading that book, but he kept it open, on the exact page Merritt had marked, because she had folded that corner with the belief that she would come back and keep reading. And keeping the book open was how he kept that belief alive, because setting something down isn't the same as forgetting. If you've stayed until this point, thank you from the bottom of my heart. This story was written for those who understand that love doesn't mean turning yourself into someone else's cure, but standing beside them long enough for them to find their own way to heal, and while doing that, not forgetting to heal yourself too. The lesson is simple. We can't save anyone by losing ourselves, but we can choose to stay, at the right distance, in the right way, and let our presence remind the other person that they deserve to be all right. How did this story make you feel? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every comment and truly want to hear what you felt deep in your heart. If this story touched you, please press like, share it with someone you think also needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for new stories every week. Wishing all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and wholeness every day. Goodbye, everyone, and I'll see you again in the next video.